Hello and welcome to my Learn With Me Minifreak series. This is episode 0, my first impressions. So first, what is a Learn With Me series? Well, a Learn With Me series is where you get to follow along with my end-to-end process, learning to get the best out of a synthesizer. Now this series is a little bit different from the other two because, unlike the other two where I'd relatively recently received the synthesizer, I've had this synthesizer for about 1 year and I've been planning to do this series, but I haven't got around to it until now. So I am still going to follow the end-to-end process. I'm still going to act as though this is my first time with the synthesizer, and hopefully I'm going to demonstrate features in a way that is both informative with respect to considering buying the synthesizer and informative with respect to how to use it and how to get the best out of it. With that being said, here is my unboxing. So I'd say the box is your typical Arturia box, which is nice graphic design, relatively good physical construction, no real concerns about anything being damaged. It shipped perfectly fine. Foam looks good. Power supply provided, relatively minimal packaging. Other than that, there's a registration card and a quick start guide. My first time handling the synthesizer, I would say it definitely felt a lot more robust than the Minifreak, but having used the Hydrasynth, it doesn't feel quite as sturdy as that. Design-wise, I would say I'm quite pleased with it. I quite like the look of this little recess. I like these little ends on the ends of the keyboard. That all looks interesting, and I think it's a good design language that they've gone for here, which reflects the Minifreak, but I think it looks a little bit more mature. We've got a set of encoders here. The ones with the lines on are all potentiometers. We've got the mod matrix from before. We've got these touch keys, which are controlling the arpeggiator and the sequencer. We have touch strips for pitch bend and mod wheel, which also have 3 separate functions. This is a 6-voice polyphonic synthesizer with an analog filter, but just like the Minifreak, it has a paraphonic mode. But the Minifreak was a 1-voice synthesizer with a special mode which could run 4 instances of that oscillator to give 4-part paraphony. In this case, we have the 6 voices, each with 2 oscillators, and the 2 oscillators can run in a special paraphonic mode whereby all the 6 analog filters get used. So that means if you play less than 6 voices, then you are using a separate filter, so it's really polyphonic in that sense. But once you get above 6, then you're reusing the filters. In any case, I think the main thing to do today is to go through the first few patches to give you a feel for how I enjoy the sound of the synthesizer. First sound called Crusty Pluck. This is a paraphonic sound. Let's go. So we can hear on the tail there a little bit of noise. So I think what's going on is some distortion and some compression. It gives you a very lo-fi vibe. Note that this is a paraphonic sound, as I was just alluding to. So we actually have 12 voices to use. I don't have 12 fingers, but there's an example of 10, and all of them ring out true. And I wouldn't say it's too offensive compared to some paraphonic sounds. Next. This one is a pad. So I describe it as having a good presence in the bass. I would call that a fairly warm, not hugely unusual, but a quite warm, quite playable pad sound. Let's move on. Mr. Funky B, category bass, so let's try. Let's try the mod wheel. So you can hear that that brings in a vibrato, but also it's doing something to the filter, which is interesting. Quite a playable bass sound, I would say. Next one, Mojo lead. Clean, a little bit of effects going on, but it's not drowned in effects, which is good. I find the presets on a lot of synthesizers are really effect heavy, and it's hard to get clean sound, so this is a good usable out-the-box sound in a mix. Simple vibrato on the mod wheel. Pitch bend works as you expect. Playable lead sound. Next, bass. Very crunchy, very distorted. You can hear the noise on the tail, so I think this is using compression again. A pleasing sound, I would describe it as. I think it's not really the type of sound I typically use, but I can hear a very modern edge there. Let's move on. The sequence, the arpeggiator is enabled, called Celeste. What's next? Interesting sound. Bell-like, not exactly a physical modeling sound, but a quite pleasing bell pluck, some effects to add some character, but again, not completely drowned in those. We can see a little preview of how the arpeggiator works. It was randomized and it was playing across 3 octaves. Let's move on. Ecstatic sequence. So the sequencer is enabled here. So we can see that we can play the sequence transposing using the keyboard, so that's an interesting feature. We can also see that these steps are highlighted here to tell us something about which steps have notes enabled on them. We'll go into detail about this later on. Another thing we haven't explored are the macros. So one of the features that the Minifreak has that the Microfreak didn't is a pair of macro controllers, each of which can route to 4 destinations. So those will be good for performances like this. So let's try. So you can hear this is bringing the oscillator, the sound of the second oscillator up and down. And that's changing the rate of the LFO. So a performance feature there embedded, and I think this is going to be quite compelling once you get to see how the ARP and the sequencer work. There's a lot of capability there. Sci-fi slam. So interesting there. So we have a very drum-like percussive initial sound with a washy noise, and then we move into a sample and hold type of sound. So it's interesting to hear that transition. So I'm guessing that's going to be using maybe an LFO key synced or maybe an envelope, but it hints at some of the possibilities. Let's try the macros. So on the display, it's telling us when I adjust the macro, which of the parameters are being adjusted. Very interesting variation, very playable. I just sit down, I just experiment with this, and I get something which I think is demonstrating the capabilities here. Let's move on. Gigasaw. very, very strong. We can see this is in a unison mono mode. So we've got all the voices sitting there on that one note. And it's a very, very punchy sound. Possibly not the type of sound that I'd ordinarily use, but I think if that's the tone you're looking for, a very usable lead out the box. Geiger keys, play. So you get what you pay for here. That's to say, you're hearing this key sound almost in the background, and you're hearing this crackly noise, which is reminiscent of a Geiger counter. Quite an atmospheric sound, a little bit more effects on this than I've been hearing on the other ones, but again, playable in the right context. 11, flicker pad, maybe major key. So, interestingly rhythmic, interestingly glitchy. I suspect this is taking advantage of the LFO section, which has an interesting feature called the wave shaper mode, where you can draw in the shape that the LFO will employ, and you can have those steps be done once per tempo step, so you can make some interesting tempo synced sounds. Welded leads. So an unorthodox take on a lead sound, but it is a playable lead. I quite enjoy the rhythmic glitchiness of that. So far, I've been quite happy with the presets. Next one, plat include. Okay. Monophonic. So macro 2, a very big timbre change, and the mod wheel, just a subtle change, brightening the sound a little bit, letting, I think, a distortion come through. This is all demonstrating to me, I think, that there is enough complexity in the design of the synthesizer here that you can make a very broad range of sounds, and I think you can create some sounds which you would traditionally look to a computer to make, which is quite a pleasant surprise for me. Moving on. This is ARP. What was I had? Nice plucky sound, a nice rhythmic delay, adding some additional timbre rhythmic variation. I could definitely see myself making sounds like that, and already, though I am someone who's not a great user of arpeggiators, or even sequencers so much for that matter, I can see what you can get with the arpeggiator and sequencer here, and I think those are a key part of the value this offers you. EBM bass. So one thing that I noted there is the macros, because they're touch strips, you can jump instantaneously between values. So this gives some capacity for rhythmic performance variation. So I think that's quite a pleasing option to have open to you. The mod wheel also, I think I do like a physical mod wheel, but I can definitely get used to a touch strip, and this is working well for me. When I talk about these macros, by the way, I'm talking in some part in comparison to the Hydrosynth. The Hydrosynth has macros, and it has 8 macros available to you, but they are on encoders. So though there is a button to allow you to instantaneously jump to a value, it's hard to do this sort of impromptu rhythmic variation. And this gives you a very easy way to rapidly adjust the value and land on a particular value you're looking for. So I think touch strips for macros I like. Almost there. Oops. What was I? Barely a note. Pad. Okay. Let's play. Lives up to the name, barely a note. That's to say you're not hearing something which is very strongly pitched, though it is pitched. An interesting texture, sort of noisy wash, but it doesn't sound like it's drowned in a reverb. So again, an interesting balance between timbral variation and use of effects, but effects used as a seasoning rather than a dominant ingredient, which I'm happy with. Another sequencer. The mod wheel. So again, nice demonstration of the macros here. Simple, just extending the attack to soften the sound. The other one was changing some volumes and some oscillator parameters. One of the things I like in general about using the mod wheel, for example, is I can make a sound which has sub-variants, which you can select by moving the mod wheel and leaving it there. I could imagine using the macros in the same way, so I can make a sound, and though they can be performed in real time, the user can also listen, fine-tune those parameters, and play it in that way, which I think is a nice way of adding more value to presets on a synth like this. Picky lead. Compressor in use again. Interesting use of interesting take on a lead. Definitely not the sort of lead that I would use. Also interesting that is polyphonic unison, so you can play more than one note. Maybe not my taste, but I could see someone getting into that type of sound. D and B drums. So this macro is adjusting an effect. This is making some envelope and LFO changes. And the mod wheel it sounded like filtering, but it wasn't really filtering. But what I think this illustrates is that even though this is a pitch synthesizer, with some adjustments of the modulation in the sequencer, you see we have adjustments of cutoff and LFO rates. You can make things which don't sound like a classic pitched sound. And I think that's something of a testament to the flexibility that this has to offer you. Number 20, last one I'm going to look at, I think. Let's see. So I think this demonstrates to an extent what I was talking about, how you might choose to use the macros in the mod wheel. In this case, I think the sound was an FM based sound for sure, but a little dull compared to what you might be used to on something like a DX7 where you've got 6 operators, because the FM oscillator only has 2 operators. But the macros allow you to choose from a whole range of different timbres, more aggressive, less aggressive, and so forth. And I think that capacity makes a sound which could, on the face value, be a little dull, although very usable in the mix and in the right context. It gives you some flexibility to explore. In any case, I've gone through the first 20 of these patches, which I had intended to do. I'm going to come back and give you maybe a bit of a more structured overview of how the synthesizer sits together, but my first impression is I enjoy it, and I think it has a lot to offer, which is not immediately obvious at face value. In any case, I hope you'll join me for some more episodes, but thank you very much for joining me today in any case, and goodbye.